Welcome back, everybody. So this is episode 1, actually, of a new series I want to do on op-eds that I've written. I do a regular column with the Daily Wire. And so every once in a while, I will do a short episode just like this one, just briefing you on exactly what I wrote about, in case you don't like to read. So first one, COVID culture wars. This was published a couple weeks ago. And as you can imagine, it's about COVID and it's about lockdowns, and it's how the culture wars, how the different ways in which the left and the right think inform different policy measures when it comes to lockdowns. By the way, this is also going to be one of our first episodes that is being put on YouTube online, and there's going to be video attached to it. So we're going to upload all podcasts onto YouTube. Most of them will just have like an image or something, and then you can, listen to it. But I'm going to try and start doing more and more video to go along with the podcast so that you can see my beautiful face. And remember to give us 5 stars. So the YouTube channel that you've got to go to, because I have 2, but the one you need to go to is Rep Dan Crenshaw. That's my official YouTube channel. Rep Dan Crenshaw. You can also find all my Here's the Truth videos. Everything we do in the office is on that YouTube channel. So check it out. That's Rep Dan Crenshaw. That's where we're going to start uploading all of these podcasts as well. So let's get to it. COVID culture wars. Lockdowns are back. Well, at least they were for a little bit. Actually, when I wrote this, there was heavy-handed lockdowns happening just a couple weeks ago. I've been happy to see many Democrat governors, Cuomo, Gavin Newsom, a couple others, start to show some skepticism about the effectiveness of lockdowns, and maybe note that maybe they're actually detrimental to the people that they're supposed to serve. So we're going to talk about why that is. We're going to talk about all the different levels of thinking that have gone into this over the past 8 months. But when I wrote this a couple weeks ago, everybody was still pretty lockdown happy. What was happening 2 weeks ago? Oh, President Trump was still president 2 weeks ago. That's what was happening. But as I will note here, that's not the only thing. That's not the only aspect here. So first, let's get something just out there right away. Lockdowns don't work. All right. I've been saying this for a really long time. If you listen to my podcast regularly, I've had many guests on, and we talk about I think what is a pretty overwhelming amount of evidence that suggests that they simply don't work. In this particular piece that I wrote, I go into at least I link to at least one story that talks about this, and it's from a data firm that just really analyzes. Look, is there any correlation between decreasing the spread and severe lockdowns? And it finds that there really isn't. In fact, what this statistical analysis finds, and it goes a lot more than just policy, by the way. It actually looks at behaviors and how those behaviors changed, maybe according to Google Maps and cell phone data, and how those behaviors changed in relation to a baseline of behaviors as well. And it actually found that there's probably more spread during lockdowns. Now that's a bit counterintuitive. That I'm not sure that that's really true, in this particular piece notes that as well. But you can imagine a scenario, in fact, where if you're locking down businesses, if you're telling people to stay at home, if you're not letting them go out and drink with their friends and go out to eat out at restaurants, well, they're still socializing, and they're going to end up socializing in a living room, all right, less well ventilated than, say, a restaurant. So it actually might be intuitive that lockdowns can actually contribute to some sort of spread. Other data shows that restaurants, for instance, are just not where spreads are happening. I mean, it's a very tiny percentage of infections can be traced back to restaurant use. So we've known this for a while. I've been beating my head against the wall, saying this that lockdowns have far more costs than any benefits. And I think a logical conclusion from all the evidence would be that they just don't help. They just don't help. And heavy-handed lockdowns definitely don't help compared to much more much smaller measures that take place. Okay, but why are we doing this? I mean, I love the internet meme. All right, it asks a very shrewd question. If a lockdown worked the first time, why are we doing it again? If a lockdown didn't work the first time, why are we doing it again? Well, that's a good question. But the question I really wanted to answer in this piece was, why do we think so differently about it? why does the question of lockdowns fall almost entirely along partisan lines? That's not something I expected, and it's been something I've been very curious about for months, in fact, as I realized that this was going to end up being a left versus right issue, when in reality it shouldn't be. Like, you can imagine it being an urban versus rural issue. You can imagine it being an issue where people are divided depending on whether they can work from home or whether they can't. Simple job loss versus non-job loss issue. But it really does fall along partisan lines. You can see that in the different states where lockdowns have happened. You can also see that in people's behavior. I mean, look, I'm constantly moving between Houston and Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is like 110% Democrat. Okay, I know that's not possible. That's a joke, but it basically is. And Houston is much more mixed. It's not some bastion of red, just by the way, but it's definitely much more mixed, and Texans tend to like their freedoms a lot more. And the behaviors that I witness are vastly different. Ever since March, they're just vastly different. It's unlikely in the Houston area that I see people walking their dogs alone, on a street corner or a sidewalk or a park wearing a mask. They don't do that because there's no point in doing that, right? They're socially distanced. There's no one around them. There's no reason to signal that you're part of the team by wearing a mask. And so people just don't do it. I don't know necessarily how they're voting, but they just don't do it as much. In DC, I see it all the time. All the time. People shaming each other in public. Again, even though you're outside, you're completely socially distanced, you're not near anybody else. There's no scientific reason to be wearing a mask, but in a place like Washington, D.C., and I would say the same about New York and Boston, plenty of other in California, places I've been traveling to for the last 8 months for all sorts of reasons. You would see this kind of behavior. The behavior is very, very different depending on if you're in a part of the country that is more conservative versus much more liberal. The reporting on COVID is always different too, right? Conservatives are always saying, look, let's contextualize the COVID data. If we're going to talk about total deaths and total infections, let's also talk about, well, who's at risk? How many people died who are above the age of 65? How many people died who have certain risk factors associated with that? What's your actual chance of being harmed by this if you are this age, or if you're a young person? And on the left, if you hear reporting just from CNN or MSNBC, they're more likely to say, look, anybody can die from this. Well, yeah, that's true, but that you could say that about anything. You do need to contextualize it. You do need to add some kind of, risk analysis. How likely is it that you would be harmed from this? Because as it turns out, yes, you can die from this if you're a healthy 18-year-old. That it's true. It's possible. But you're also more likely to die from the flu, just on a statistical basis. So they don't like to say that, but the right does. Why is that? We're going to talk about that. Let's get through some of the main explanations for this partisan divide that a lot of people fall on, and I alluded to it earlier, which is because Trump, right? Anything that Trump is in favor of, the left opposes, and I think that has something to do with it. I really do, and I think the fact that so many Democrat governors have changed their tune on lockdowns just in the last few days since Biden took office is maybe some proof of this. It's definitely the most cynical explanation. I hate believing that people would actually harm their own citizens just because of an election. But again, the reason I don't think this is a full-on explanation is because of also what I mentioned earlier. Honestly, the behaviors in different cities are vastly different. Like the people themselves think very, very differently about the benefits of lockdowns, the benefits of mask wearing, just what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. You can see it, okay? You can see it in the polling, depending on where you're at, and you can see it in people's behavior. So I don't think the politics of it is a full explanation. And so why? Well, why does the left legitimately fear the virus more? Again, I think there's some legitimate fears that occur far more in left-wing circles than there are in right-wing circles. So I think it's the way we assess risk. And this is where things get pretty interesting. When it comes to liberals and conservatives, we differ widely in how we perceive risk, as well as the decisions we make when confronting risky situations. So there's some interesting research that actually measures brain activity between liberals and conservatives when playing a risk-oriented game. Okay, and the findings are pretty interesting. So let's talk about what the game is and why I think this doesn't quite tell the whole story. So the game is really like a financial risk game, more like a betting game. And okay, so that does measure some degree of risk taking. But in the experiment, they couldn't find any difference in behavioral changes. So like the actual behavior being done, the actual risks being taken weren't that different between liberals and conservatives. But what was vastly different was the way their brain activity reacted, especially in the amygdala region. Okay, so there's actually a physiological response that is different when confronted with risk between liberals and conservatives, even though in this particular experiment it didn't play out in a behavioral setting. Their choices being made were not actually any different. But it is fascinating that our brains actually work differently. So how would we figure out if we're going to make different choices? That's a really interesting question. So I looked at careers because I think that's a pretty good indication of choices being made, and especially choices being made that confront physical risk. Now that gets at the heart of what we're actually talking about here with respect to COVID lockdowns. Like, are we truly scared of this? Because it's a physical risk. To be out there in the wild, in the midst of COVID. So I looked at careers, and as it turns out, I think everybody knows this intuitively, conservatives tend to choose more physically risky careers. Conservatives are more likely to be high-end doctors. You're doing a risky activity there. They're more likely to be in the military, more likely to be in law enforcement, more likely to be in lumberjacking, and these high-risk physical labor type of careers. Liberals are not, more likely to be in academia, office jobs, things like that. And again, you go to the op-ed. I link to a lot of this research as well, which shows this. So that's a pretty interesting observation. Conservatives appear to be less risk averse to physical threats and therefore far less likely to favor more extreme actions to mitigate that risk. And that also, so that's one part of it. I think the next part of it is there's a cultural difference between how liberals and conservatives believe in problem solving and the extent to which government should be responsible for that problem solving. And this is dispositional. I say this all the time when I talk about the difference between the left and the right. The liberal mind, the conservative mind, these are dispositions. They're dispositions that we then use to formulate, I think, frameworks to solve problems. And so in the liberal mind, just about anything can be solved by government. If we just try collectively hard enough, if we just believe that we can do, then we can solve it. An extreme example of this, and one comical one I love to bring up, is in the UK. They actually have a minister of loneliness. Yeah, just pause. Minister of loneliness. Like, that's a real thing. It still is a real thing, because even apparently a case of the SADS is something that government intervention can solve. So, look, conservatives just don't believe this. We reject this as what I would call unmitigated hubris. It results in unrealistic goals and excessive costs. This belief that government can just solve anything, to include loneliness. And liberals just favor action, right? So it's action, action, action. It's a disposition towards action, a bias towards action, even at a high cost. And it's even better if that action is collective in nature. Everything's the moral equivalent of war. It's the war on poverty. It's the war on inequality. It's the war on COVID. Because only in war do we plan and act and execute with feverish collectivism. So that preference for collective action means that a proper cost-benefit analysis is pretty much cast aside. Rational questions about the effectiveness of lockdowns or whether their benefit exceeds the cost, which I think would be the first question, those are ignored. They're actually considered offensive because the reply is always, yeah, but if it saves one life, I guess you just don't care about, and they can have an example right away. It's just you don't care that this person was killed by COVID, right? Now, the conservative mind just doesn't work that way, right? We understand that, look, there's only so much government can do. Now, the Biden administration is learning that one in its fullest form right now is they basically copy exactly the Trump administration's plans on vaccine distribution, the travel restrictions, which were considered racist like 5 minutes ago. But they're basically copying it all because, look, it was easy to just demean and criticize the Trump administration and say, well, gosh, if we were in charge, we would do it a lot better. But when they're actually in charge, it turns out there's only so much government can do to stop the spread of a global pandemic that has been ongoing for now almost a year. Like, as it turns out, it's actually hard. Maybe a little bit of grace is in order and humility might be in order on what is actually possible. And obviously, the more actions you take, the more costs you impose. And everybody who has been saying otherwise has been lying to you through their teeth. The conservative disposition is to understand this basic fact. It's, again, this is an explanation. This is a fundamental difference between the left and the right and how we approach all problem solving. And it helps explain why conservatives just as a whole have been against lockdowns, because you have to prove to us that there's a very serious benefit here that is worth the massive costs. And that has never been proven. Never. And in fact, the opposite has been proven, and it's only now that many Democrat governors are realizing it. And so I said before, the battle cry of the left is often, if it saves one life. If it saves one life, then it's worth it, right? It makes them sound more compassionate. And this gets to another big difference in how we think. I'm going to use Jonathan Haidt's research a lot in this series of op-eds that I do, because basically I'm always trying to explain how the culture informs policy, how psychology informs policy. So I reference Dr. Jonathan Haidt quite a bit. He's a moral psychologist at NYU. He's written a great book called The Righteous Mind. He's written The Coddling of the American Mind. And he finds that in his research that there's multiple moral foundations. There's compassion, there's fairness, there's moral authority and tradition, loyalty to in-groups, sanctity, liberty. These are all moral foundations. And when you ask people a series of questions and surveys, you get at how they really prioritize each one of those moral foundations. And what he finds is liberals exclusively prioritize the first two, compassion and fairness. Now, they have a different definition of fairness than a conservative does, right? They see fairness as everybody having the exact same amount of money. A conservative sees fairness in the sense of proportionality, meaning this is how hard you work, this is what you get. That would be fair. Okay, so we view fairness a little bit differently, but we both emphasize them. But caring and compassion, that's the number one thing for the liberal mind. To the detriment of all of the other moral foundations. In fact, many of these other moral foundations, such as in-group loyalty, tradition and moral authority, like from religion, from God, liberty, sanctity. These just aren't that important to them. This is according to hundreds of thousands of surveys and lots of data. Conservatives, when surveyed on these moral foundations, tend to view all of these moral foundations about equally. So they're just equal to us. We think everything is important there. But when you overemphasize the compassionate argument, that's how you get to this sloganeering of if it saves one life, because you're just ignoring other things as even important. So this is how we're wired. I mean, it really gets down to this, how we're wired. And this is why when you try to contextualize some of the data that you see, you'll be accused by the left as downplaying the virus or just covering for Trump's failures. And this rational discussion about the costs and benefits, they kind of just get thrown out the window. So I thought that was interesting. That's why I wrote about it. Hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next one.